At first light, while the alkali dust still lay on her husband's boots, Nora Bell saw her one-eyed goat walk out of the Black Hills, with a brass watch chain tangled around its horn. The chain was Abel's. She knew it before she touched it. She knew the worn link near the clasp, the little dent where Abel had once dropped the watch on a stone threshold. The dark thread he had tied through the end because he said a man in this country ought to fasten everything twice. The watch itself was gone. Only the chain remained, hooked in the goat's horn, and sticky with a brown stain the dust had not quite covered. Juniper, the goat, stood in the yard as if she had brought home nothing stranger than a mouthful of weeds. Then she turned around and started back toward the Badlands. Nora should have gone to the sheriff. That was what a decent woman was supposed to do when the dead sent something home. She should have wrapped the chain in cloth, walked the 6 miles to San Aurelio, and placed it in Sheriff Ketcham's hand like a person who still believed hands like his were made to hold truth. But Abel had been buried 4 days. The sheriff had already signed the paper calling his death a fall. And that same morning, a clerk from Pike Land and Water had come to Nora's door with a mortgage Abel had never taken, a debt Nora had never seen, and a 30-day clock ticking over the only ground she had left in the world. So Nora did not go to town. She took down Abel's old Remington, put 6 cartridges in the pocket of her black skirt, and followed the goat. The wind had blown white the night before, one of those hard desert winds that made every fence line vanish and left the basin looking as if bone meal had been sifted over it. The country north of San Aurelio was all pale flats and brittle grass, but south of Nora's place the land rose into a field of black volcanic stone the locals called the Cinders. No one used it, no one cut through it, even cattle avoided it, because the rock held the heat and the cracks went deeper than a horse's leg could forgive. Abel had gone there the week before he died. He had not told her until after, but Nora found the map in his tool chest. 3 pencil marks near a wash called Saint's Mouth, and a line of numbers copied from the county land book. Abel had been a surveyor once, before the dry years made every honest trade uncertain. Numbers the way some men knew scripture. He knew when a boundary had been moved by weather. And he knew when it had been moved by a man with a pen. Cassian Pike had counted on people not knowing the difference. Pike owned the water company, 2 freight contracts, half the courthouse roof, and nearly every debt that had ever passed through San Aurelio after a bad harvest. He had a soft beard, a silver-topped cane, and a habit of speaking to poor men as if he were forgiving them for being born. For 9 years he had been buying ranches around the basin. First the wells failed, then the notes came due. Then the county books changed in small, careful ways. He shifted 20 rods. A spring that had always belonged to one family appeared on the plat of another. An old Spanish grant became unclear. A widow's signature appeared on a paper she had never touched. By the time the family understood what had happened, Pike's men were already at the gate, polite as undertakers. Abel had started keeping copies. Nora had watched him do it at their kitchen table, his head bent over papers, the lamplight making his face look older than 41. He had copied dates, names, loan amounts, and the same notary mark appearing where it ought not appear. He had gone quiet in those weeks, not frightened quiet, sharpened quiet. When she asked him what he meant to do, he said, "I mean to make the paper tell on the men." A week later, they found him at the bottom of a dry wash, with his survey bag gone and his neck broken. Sheriff Ketcham said he must have slipped. Nora said Abel Bell had walked rough country since he was 12 and would no more slip in a dry wash than a hawk would drown in dust. The men at the graveside looked at the ground. One woman touched Nora's sleeve as if grief were an illness she might catch. Somebody behind her murmured that grief made some women wild. Nora heard it. She had been hearing such things all her life. difficult, sour-tongued, too quick with a question. A woman who understood when a thing was settled. She had learned young that the world used the word settled when it meant buried. Now Abel's watch chain was in her palm, warm from the goat's body, and the goat was climbing toward the cinders with the steady, stubborn gait of an animal that had never cared what men called impossible. The first mile took them over hardpan. The second climbed through mesquite and thorn. By the third, the sun had cleared the rim, and the black stones had begun to throw heat upward, turning the air into a trembling skin. Juniper did not slow. From rock to rock with a delicacy that would have seemed foolish in anything but a goat. Twice Nora lost sight of her. Twice the small white body appeared again between the stones, looking back with her one yellow eye, as if Nora were the one causing delay. Saint's Mouth was not a canyon so much as a slit in the earth, hidden behind a leaning wall of basalt. Abel's map had marked it with a cross. From above, it looked like shadow. From within, it smelled of cool stone, old water, and something metallic beneath both. Juniper entered without a sound. Nora followed, turning sideways through the first narrow cut. Behind her, the desert light shrank to a blade. The passage widened into a hollow of black rock, where a cottonwood had somehow rooted itself in the seam. Its leaves trembled, though no wind reached them. At the base of that tree, half buried under fallen stone, was a door. Not a door in a house, not even a door a reasonable person would have built. It was a square of iron set flat into the earth, ringed with stone dust, with a handle darkened by age, and a coat of grease that had been touched recently enough to hold a thumbprint. Nora crouched. The thumbprint was not Abel's. Abel's hands were long and narrow. This print was broad, with a torn ridge crossing the pad handle once. Nora set the rifle beside her, put both hands to the iron ring, and pulled. The door lifted with a low, sealed groan. Cold air breathed up from below, carrying the smell of lamp oil, rope, and paper shut away too long from the sun. A ladder disappeared into the dark. On the third rung down, a strip of cloth had snagged against a nail. Red flannel. Abel had worn a red flannel shirt the day he left. Nora went down. The chamber below had been dug from the old rock and braced with mine timber. It was not a mine. There was no ore cart, no pick marks chasing a vein, no tunnel running off toward profit. It was a hiding place made by someone who knew how to disappear and did not expect disappearing to be enough. Her boots touched dirt. She waited until her eyes adjusted. A shelf ran along the wall. On it stood 2 lamp tins, a canteen, a sack of flour hardened to a white brick, and a folded blanket with a cavalry stamp nearly worn away. Beneath the shelf sat a crate of cartridges and a rifle wrapped in oilcloth. The rifle's barrel was spotless. The dust on the floor was not. That contradiction stopped her more surely than a shout. The room had been abandoned long enough for dust to soften every corner, and yet the rifle had been cared for. The canteen was full. The wick had been trimmed. Someone had come here. Someone might still come here. Nora lit the lamp anyway. The flame rose, caught, and showed her the far wall. There were marks scratched into it, not random marks, but columns. Names, dates, numbers. A list cut into stone by a hand that had wanted the record to survive even if the paper burned. Malone, well sold, 1881. Reyes, boundary moved, 1882. Haskell, note altered, 1884. Chen, water deed missing, 1885. Bell, survey copied, 1889. Her own name waited at the bottom like a grave dug before the body arrived. On the floor beneath the scratched wall was Abel's watch. Glass had cracked. The hands had stopped at 11 minutes past 2. Nora picked it up and found blood in the hinge, the same brown that stained the chain. For one breath, the whole chamber narrowed to the small dead circle in her hand. Then she saw the ledger. It lay inside a tin bread box beneath a loose plank, wrapped in canvas and tied with wire. The cover was blue, faded almost gray. On the first page, in a cramped clerk's hand, someone had written, "Private Register of Cassian Pike's Land Acquisitions and Alterations, kept by E.R. Vale, 1880 to 1886. Elias Rowan Vale." Nora knew the name. Everyone in San Aurelio knew it, though most pretended not to. Vale had been Pike's bookkeeper, a thin, nervous man with spectacles and ink on his cuffs. 6 years ago, he vanished after a drunken quarrel at the public well. Pike said Vale had stolen money and fled west. Sheriff Ketcham repeated it until repetition became fact. A month later, Pike acquired the last 4 parcels needed to control the only reliable water road through the basin. Nora opened the ledger. Page after page listed the machine in its own language. True boundaries, altered boundaries, names of clerks paid, names of witnesses invented, names of families pressured, starved, threatened, ruined. There were receipts for deputy wages marked as livestock protection. There were letters copied in a second hand, instructions from Pike to move a spring from one plat to another. There were notes beside certain families. Break before frost, frightened boy, burn south haystack, offer half by Friday. On the last written page, the clerk had stopped using business language. "I helped build it," he had written. "I told myself numbers had no blood in them. I was wrong. Every number here has a body under it. If I am found dead, look under Saint's mouth. Live long enough, I will bring this to a court that Pike has not yet purchased." Nora turned the page. There, pressed flat between the leaves, was a letter in Abel's hand. "Nora, if I do not come home with this, do not take it to Ketcham. Do not take it to Judge Mercer. Do not let any man who drinks with Pike touch it. Find Inez Mora. She knows where the other half is." A sound moved above her. Not the goat, not stones settling. A boot step. Nora blew out the lamp. The dark fell so completely that the stopped watch in her palm seemed louder than her breathing. She slid the ledger into the canvas satchel hanging from a peg, pushed Abel's watch into her pocket, and lifted the oiled rifle from the shelf, because Abel's Remington suddenly felt like a sentimental object in a practical room. Above, voices entered the hollow. "Goat came through here, Sheriff Ketcham." Nora had known his voice since she was a girl. He had a way of speaking through his nose when he was annoyed, as if the world had a smell he could not approve of. Another man said, "It's a crack in the rocks. You think she crawled in after it?" Ketcham answered, "I think Bell crawled somewhere he shouldn't have. I think Pike wants every hole in these stones opened before sundown." A third voice, lower, said, "And if we find papers?" The sheriff's answer came almost gently, "Then the papers don't leave." Nora stood in the black with the ledger against her ribs and understood a thing Abel had not lived long enough to understand. Finding proof was not the brave part. Men like Pike built the world so proof would die on the road. Abel had gone into the dark and found the first half of the truth. Then he had walked it straight toward men who had spent years learning how to stop a man on a road. Nora would not make his mistake. She waited until the voices moved away, waited until the sun shifted above and a blade of light found the ladder again. Then she climbed out, lowered the iron door exactly as she had found it, and brushed dust over the ring with the hem of her skirt. Juniper stood under the cottonwood, chewing a leaf with the calm of a saint who had fulfilled her miracle and preferred not to discuss it. Nora looked down at the goat. "You could have done this yesterday," she said. The goat blinked. By nightfall, Nora was back at her kitchen table with the blue ledger open, Abel's watch beside it, and the mortgage Pike's clerk had delivered lying on the other side like an insult waiting for a reply. The house felt different now. Not safer, not kinder, but less empty. Abel's last letter had crossed the threshold with her. His voice had not come back. But his warning had. Find Inez Mora. She knows where the other half is. Inez lived in San Aurelio's old quarter, in a house with thick clay walls and blue bottles hung in the window to catch evil before it entered. She had delivered half the town, buried the other half, and outlived every man who ever mistook silence for ignorance. People called her a midwife because it was easier than naming all the things she carried. Nora left before dawn. She took the wash road instead of the main road and walked, because her one riding horse had gone lame in April, and because a widow on foot drew less attention than a widow borrowing speed. Juniper followed for half a mile, then wandered off toward the hills, as if this errand no longer concerned her. The town was still gray when Nora reached Inez's back gate. A boy opened it before she knocked. He was 10 or 11, barefoot, hair standing in every direction, with the exhausted eyes of a child who had been awake all night listening to adults lie. "Inez said you'd come," he whispered. Inside, the old woman sat at the kitchen table with a shawl over her shoulders and a pistol in front of her teacup. She was small enough to look breakable until she looked at you. Then the size of her body seemed beside the point. "You found Saint's mouth," Inez said. Nora placed Abel's letter on the table. Inez did not touch it. She read it from where she sat, lips moving once over Abel's name. When she finished, she closed her eyes. Not in grief exactly, in recognition. "I told him not to go alone," she said. "You knew?" "I knew he was asking questions. I knew he had more courage than caution. That combination feeds graveyards." Nora set the blue ledger beside the letter. "He said you have the other half." Inez rose slowly and crossed to the hearth. From behind a loose brick, she took a packet wrapped in oilskin. Inside was a stack of county plat copies, several signed affidavits, and a small black book no wider than a hymnal. "This is what Vale left before he vanished," she said. "Not the ledger. The key to reading it. Which clerk changed what? Which judge looked away? Which deputy rode with which gang? Pike's money is in your book. His hands are in this one." Nora stared at the black book. Why keep it all this time? Inez gave her a tired smile. "Because some truths arrive before their witness does. You keep them fed, them dry. You wait." Before Nora could answer, 3 knocks struck the front door. They were not loud. That was what made them frightening. A loud knock asks a question. This knock announced a habit of entering. Inez picked up the pistol and slid it beneath her shawl. The boy slipped into the pantry without being told. Nora flattened herself beside the kitchen wall, the rifle angled downward, the satchel pressed to her hip. Sheriff Ketcham's voice came through the front room. "Mrs. Mora, morning." "I was asleep," Inez said, in a tone that made the lie an accusation. "Looking for Nora Bell." "Then you should try Nora Bell's house." "We did. She isn't there." "Then perhaps your feet work better than your eyes." There was a pause. Ketcham said, "Pike's prepared to be generous. Today, not tomorrow. He'll settle the mortgage, give her traveling money, and forget the way grief makes people steal what isn't theirs. What did she steal? Property. If you mean her husband's watch chain, I expect death left that to her. The silence after that was so sharp, Nora could feel it through the wall. Ketcham said, "You tell her to come to Pike's office at noon, alone." "I will tell her nothing," Inez said. "I am old enough to choose which errands die in my mouth." When Inez returned to the kitchen, the pistol was still under her shawl, but her hand shook now. Only once, then it stopped. "You have until noon to be somewhere they don't expect," she said. "Where?" Inez looked toward the pantry. "Tomas." The boy emerged. "Go to the stable behind the chapel. Tell Mrs. Crow the Black Road is open." He nodded once and ran. Nora watched him disappear into the alley. "How many of you are there?" Inez began wrapping the black book in cloth. "Enough to keep people alive. Not enough to win." By mid-morning, Nora was riding a dun mule along an abandoned salt road with the blue ledger, the black book, Abel's watch, and Pike's forged mortgage all sewn inside a feed sack that smelled convincingly of onions. Mrs. Crow, who owned the stable and had arms like a cooper, gave the mule without asking for payment and gave instructions as if she had been waiting years to speak them. "Do not take the North Bridge. Ketcham watches it. At the broken windmill, turn east. If you reach Dove Tank by sundown, ask for Lottie Crane. Tell her Inez sent you and the Black Road is open." "The Black Road?" Nora asked. Mrs. Crow tightened the cinch. "The road women use when the white one belongs to men with guns." Nora rode. The desert widened. The cinders fell behind her. Heat came up from the ground, hard and shimmering. Twice she saw dust to the west and left the road until it passed. Once, near a dry tank, two riders came close enough that she saw the flash of a star badge on one chest. She lay with the mule in a stand of brittle mesquite, one hand over its nose, the other on the rifle, while flies walked across her cheek. And she did not move. At Dove Tank, Lottie Crane was waiting. She owned a supply station that looked abandoned from the road and worked like a vein under the skin of the territory. Horses changed there. Messages changed hands. Women traveling under names that were not theirs slept in the back room and left before first light. Men came too, but fewer, and only after someone had vouched that they knew how to keep their mouths shut. Lottie read the pages by lamplight, slowly, with no expression at all. When she reached the note beside the Ray's family, her fingers stopped. "My sister," she said. Nora said nothing. Lottie turned another page. Pike took her well, then her house, then her boy. Fever finished what Pike started. She closed the ledger with care. "So no, Mrs. Bell. You are not lucky. Luck did not bring you here. We have been leaving doors unlatched for years. You are simply the first person to arrive with enough fire in her hands to make the rooms visible." A man stepped from the doorway behind her. Nora lifted the rifle before she knew she had moved. He stopped with both hands open. "Easy," he said. The door was unlatched. He was younger than she expected a federal marshal to be, perhaps 35, narrow in the face, gray at the temples, too early. His coat was dusty, his boots were worse. He had the look of a man who had ridden through 3 bad answers to reach one that might hold. "Marshal Owen Crow," he said, "United States Service, 6 months in the territory. Not long enough to owe Pike money. Long enough to know everyone else does." Nora did not lower the rifle. "I've heard that kind of claim from men whose debts were simply older than my memory." Crow nodded as if the suspicion pleased him. Good. Thinking that way. Lottie placed the blue ledger on the table between them. She found Vale's book. Crow's face changed. Not much. A tightening at the jaw, a stillness in the eyes. But Nora saw a man who had been hunting smoke suddenly find the house on fire. He sat and read. The night deepened around the station. Outside, a horse stamped once. Somewhere in the rafters, a swallow shifted. Crow read the blue ledger, then the black book, then Abel's letter. When he finished, he laid Abel's watch beside the papers as if it too were evidence. "This is enough to seize Pike's records," he said. Nora felt the first dangerous movement of hope. Then he added, "It is not enough to break him." The hope stopped. Crow tapped the black book. "This tells me who he paid. That tells me what he stole. Together, they open the door. But in federal court, Pike's lawyers will say Vale was a thief, Abel was a grieving husband chasing shadows, and you are a widow with motive to invent a devil. I need a living mouth from inside Pike's machine." "Vale is dead," Nora said. "That is what Pike once believed." The room went very still. Crow looked at Lottie, then back to Nora. 3 months ago, I received an unsigned letter telling me Elias Rowan Vale did not die in San Aurelio. Said he was hidden under another name near the old Mission Vineyards east of Tucson. I sent a deputy 2 weeks ago. The deputy has not returned. Lottie swore under her breath. Nora looked down at Abel's watch. The stopped hands pointed to 2:11, a dead hour. A number with no meaning until meaning found it. "Then we go find him," she said. Crow shook his head. "You go north with Lottie. I take the papers." "No." The word landed flat. Crow blinked once. Nora stood slowly. "My husband took paper to men and died because he believed carrying truth was work for the proper hands. I have seen proper hands. They are clean because they never hold anything long enough to get stained. I found this in the ground. I carried it past the sheriff. I listened to Pike's men say papers do not leave holes in the rock. I will be in the room where the papers speak." Crow studied her. Lottie smiled without amusement. "She means it. I can see that." "No," Nora said. "You can hear it. Men often confuse the two." That was the first time Marshal Crow laughed. It was not a happy sound, but it was human. "Then hear this," he said. "If you stay, you may be killed before your testimony matters. I may be killed in my own doorway for leaving. At least this way I know what the bullet is for." By dawn, they had a plan built from bad choices. Would ride to Tucson with copies of the ledger pages sewn beneath the saddle pad. Crow and Nora would take the salt road east toward the Mission Vineyards, where Vale might be alive, or might be a rumor that had already cost a deputy his life. Inez's boy would carry a false trail back toward San Aurelio, not alone, but with Mrs. Crow's nephew and 3 empty saddles to make dust enough for a party. If Ketcham followed, he would follow ghosts. They found Crow's deputy at noon the next day. He was alive, tied in the shade of a ruined wall, lips cracked, one eye swollen shut. Pike's men had left him there with enough water to extend the lesson. Crow that Vale had been taken 2 nights before and moved toward Tucson, not as a prisoner exactly, but as a package Pike intended to reclaim before federal ears could hear it. "Who took him?" Crow asked. The deputy swallowed. "Ben Ash," he said. Crow's face hardened. "Pike's old foreman." The deputy nodded. "But he didn't kill me. Said he was tired. Said every year Pike asked for more blood and paid less for it." Nora knelt beside the ruined wall, holding the canteen to the deputy's mouth. "Would he turn?" Crow answered before the deputy could. Men like Ash turn only when the road behind them burns hotter than the road ahead. Nora looked toward the east, where Tucson lay under a white hammer of sun. Then light it. They caught up at dusk near a dry chapel that had no roof and no bell. 2 horses stood in the wash below, reins trailing. Inside, Ben Ash sat against the altar wall with a pistol across his knees, and beside him, bound at the wrists but sitting upright, was a thin man with white hair, wire spectacles, and the hollow look of someone who had been living under an assumed name so long that his real one no longer fit comfortably. Elias Rowan Vale. He looked at Nora first, not at the marshal, not at the rifle, dressed dusty at the hem, the onion sack tied behind her saddle, and the cracked brass watch in her hand. "You are Bell's wife," he said. Nora's throat tightened. "You knew Abel?" "I knew he was the first man in 6 years who found my door without being led to it. I told him where to look. I told him not to go until I came with him." Then Ash shifted. "He went anyway." Nora turned to him. Ash was a heavy man, beard gray at the edges, eyes sunk deep in a face burned dark by weather. He looked less like a villain than Nora wanted him to. That angered her more than if he had smiled. Evil, she was learning, rarely took the trouble to look like itself. "You helped kill him," she said. Ash looked away. "I held the horses." That is a sentence cowards use to stand outside their own lives. The words hit him. She saw it. Crow stepped inside the chapel with both hands away from his guns. "Ben, you know what is coming. Pike's papers are moving. His clerks are talking. His sheriff will save himself before he saves you." Ash gave a short, bitter laugh. "Ketcham saves nothing but his stomach." "Then testify," Crow said. "Put Pike in a federal room before Pike puts you in the ground." Ash looked at Vale. Vale said quietly, "You owe the dead more than fear." For a long moment, the chapel held only the sound of insects and the dry clicking of a loosened shutter. Then Ash lowered the pistol. "I can name the riders," he said. "I can name who burned the Haskell hay. I can name who pushed Bell into the wash." Nora felt the world tilt and become very clear. Crow asked, "Was it you?" Ash shook his head. "No, Ketcham." The name entered the ruined chapel like a body. Nora did not cry. The grief in her had gone past water days ago. It had become a place inside her where each new truth could stand without drowning. "Then you will say it where he can hear you," she said. Ash nodded once. They reached Tucson in pieces. Lottie arrived first with the copies and put them in the hands of a newspaper editor named Ezra Palm, who had lost one eye in the war and used the remaining one with ruthless economy. Crow came next with Nora, Vale, Ash, and the wounded deputy. By the time Pike's telegrams began arriving at offices he thought he owned, the story was already being set in type. Palm printed at dawn. Land, water, and blood, the Pike papers. He printed the names. He printed the dates. He printed enough of the ledgers to make denial look like panic. He printed Abel Bell's name beneath a line that read, "Surveyor found dead after uncovering altered plats." By 8 o'clock, the federal building steps were full. By 9, Cassian Pike arrived in a black carriage with 2 lawyers, a doctor, and the face of a man who still believed every room had a price if one entered it calmly enough. He saw Nora on the steps. For the first time since she had learned his name, she watched Cassian Pike fail to arrange his expression. It lasted only a second. Then the soft smile returned. "Mrs. Bell," he said, removing his hat, "a hard week has made you reckless." Nora looked at him. "No, a hard week has made me exact." Inside, Judge Alaric Boone took the bench with the weary displeasure of a man dragged from patience by fools. He was newly appointed, which mattered, not yet learned which invitations to accept, which hands to shake, which debts to pretend were friendships. Crow had moved fast enough to catch him while he still belonged to the law. The first witness was Lottie Crane. She testified to her sister's land, the well moved on paper, the freight men who came after midnight, the sickness that followed when the family was forced onto dry ground. Pike's lawyers worked hard to make grief sound like confusion. Lottie let them. Then she returned to dates, documents, and the page number in Vale's blue ledger where Pike's own instruction matched the deed alteration. The courtroom felt that lock into play. Then came Inez Mora, who had ridden through the night in a wagon because, as she told the prosecutor, "I have buried too many people to let the young do all the walking." She laid the black book on the evidence table. She named judges, clerks, deputies. She named the first baby she delivered in the basin and the last man she saw leave it with everything he owned tied to a single mule. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room had to come down to her level to hear her, and once it did, it stayed there. Then they called Nora. Walked to the stand in the black dress she had worn since Abel's burial, its hem white with road dust, its sleeve torn from the ride, and Abel's watch in her pocket. She swore the oath with her right hand steady. The prosecutor asked how she found Saint's mouth. "A goat led me," Nora said. The courtroom shifted. A few men exchanged looks. Pike's lawyer made a note. The prosecutor did not smile. "Tell the court what you mean." So she told them. She told them about Juniper arriving with Abel's watch chain, about the map in Abel's chest, about the iron door under the cottonwood, the cool air rising from a room no honest map recorded, about the blue ledger hidden in a bread box, and the name scratched in the wall by a man who believed paper might burn, but stone might remember. She told them about hearing Sheriff Ketcham above her, saying papers did not leave holes in the rock. Ketcham sat 2 rows behind Pike. At that, he stopped moving. Pike's lawyer rose on cross-examination with the air of a man approaching a loose board he expected to pry up. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "you asked this court to believe that a farm animal delivered you to evidence of a conspiracy." "No," Nora said. "I asked the court to believe I followed an animal to a place my husband had already marked on a map. The goat is only the part men like you find easiest to laugh at." A murmur passed through the room. The lawyer tightened. "You are angry, are you not?" "Yes." "At Mr. Pike?" "Yes." "At the sheriff?" "Yes." "At the world, perhaps?" Nora looked at him for a long moment. "I am angry at men who use the word world when they mean themselves." The murmur became a sound before Judge Boone struck the bench. The lawyer tried another road. "Is it not true that in San Aurelio you are known as a difficult woman?" Nora almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because she had known the word would arrive eventually. It always did. Men carried it like a spare key. "Yes," she said. "Well, people mean, they mean I answer when I am spoken over. They mean I remember what I was told to forget. They mean when a paper has my husband's name on it, I look at the signature. If that is difficult, then difficult is the only honest thing anyone ever called me." This time, Judge Boone let the room speak for 3 full seconds before he called it to order. Then, Elias Vale took the stand. Pike did not turn pale all at once. His face emptied in stages. First, the smile left, then the warmth, then the careful sadness he had arranged for the benefit of the jury. By the time Vale raised his right hand, Pike looked like a man watching a locked cellar open from the inside. Vale spoke for 3 hours. He told them he had kept Pike's ledgers. He told them numbers had seemed harmless until he learned what happened after he wrote them. He told them about deputies paid as night guards, about judges receiving irrigation fees, about boundary lines moved one ledger at a time until a family's whole life appeared to have wandered off by itself. He named the day Abel Bell came to him. He named the place they met. He named the warning he gave and the regret that followed. Then Ben Ash testified. No one in the courtroom breathed comfortably while he spoke. Named riders, named fires, named wells poisoned with dead sheep, named men beaten on roads and women frightened out of claims by letters that promised their children would not make it to winter. Then he named Sheriff Dodd Ketcham as the man who had followed Abel Bell into the wash. Ketcham stood. Perhaps he meant to run. Perhaps he meant to deny it. Perhaps some old habit in him believed rising was still enough to change the shape of a room. Marshal Crow's deputy put a hand on his shoulder and sat him back down. Ash said, Bell was alive when Ketcham found him. His leg was broke. He had the survey bag. Ketcham took it. Order was, no witnesses. Nora heard a sound and realized it had come from her. Not a sob, not a word. A small break in the body when it learns the exact size of what it has been carrying. She looked at Ketcham. He would not look back. That was the last gift the law gave him before it took him. The jury returned before sunset. Guilty on conspiracy to defraud federal land claims. Guilty on bribery of public officers. Guilty on obstruction, intimidation, and accessory to murder. Pike's assets were frozen pending restitution. Sheriff Ketcham was taken under guard. 2 clerks were arrested before night. Judge Mercer tried to leave town on the evening train and found Marshal Crow waiting at the platform. Nora stood outside the federal building as the sun went down behind Tucson's roofs. The crowd moved around her, loud and alive, and hungry for the story now that the danger had a verdict attached to it. People looked at her differently. That unsettled her more than hatred had. Hatred at least had a shape she recognized. Crow came to stand beside her. You did what Abel tried to do, he said. Nora shook her head. No, Abel found the door. I found out one door was not enough. Crow waited. She looked across the street to where Ezra Palm's press lamps were already burning for the next edition. It took Abel's copies, Vale's ledger, Inez's book, Lottie's road, your badge, Ash's fear, a goat's stubborn feet, even the newspaper boy shouting before breakfast. She touched the stopped watch in her pocket. Truth did not win because it was true. It won because enough people carried it at once. Crow nodded. That is usually the part history leaves out. Nora went home in October. The Cinders looked the same from a distance. Black stone under a hard sky. Saint's mouth hidden in shadow. The cottonwood at the seam of the rocks had turned yellow, each leaf bright as a small flame. Someone had broken the padlock Pike's men put on her door. Someone else had left fresh water in the barrel and a sack of flour on the table. No name, no note. On the west wall of the house, in black paint, a sentence had been written. No widow owns what Pike has bought. Nora scrubbed it away. It took 2 days. She kept scrubbing after the words had vanished, because she had learned that some lies leave a stain after language is gone. Restitution came slowly, as all justice does when it has to pass through offices. Pike's lands were inventoried. Wells were remeasured. Families returned with wagons full of what little they had been able to keep. Some came back to houses collapsed by weather. Some came back to graves. Some did not come back at all, and their names traveled in envelopes to sons, daughters, cousins, anyone the law could find who still had a claim to what had been stolen. Inez moved into Nora's spare room that winter, after a fever made climbing her own steps an argument she no longer cared to win. Lottie sent seed. Mrs. Crow sent a mule that disliked men in hats and therefore fit the place nicely. Marshal Crow sent copies of the final orders, each bearing seals Nora had once imagined too distant to matter. Elias Vale came once, in the spring, stood at Saint's Mouth with his hat in his hands and looked down at the iron door he had greased in secret for 6 years. "I thought I was keeping evidence alive," he said. Nora stood beside him. Juniper grazed nearby among bitter weeds, unimpressed by history. "You were," Nora said. Vale shook his head. "No, I was keeping guilt alive. You made it useful." He asked what she meant to do with the chamber. Nora had thought about that. "Leave it," she said. "Not hidden, not cleaned, not turned into a shrine. Leave it as a room that tells the truth badly enough no one can make it pretty." They set a marker at the opening, not a grand one, a piece of cedar with words burned deep. Here, paper hid until hands were ready. Years later, children would dare each other to climb down. Some would say the room was haunted. Some would say a one-eyed goat still guarded it. Some would say a widow found gold under the rocks, because people prefer gold to documents when making legends. Nora let them talk. She had no interest in correcting every story, only the ones that turned the guilty clean. By the next summer, the basin had changed in ways a stranger might miss. More smoke rose from chimneys. Fences stood straighter. Wells had names again. At town meetings, men who had once lowered their voices when Pike's riders passed now argued loudly about water schedules and school repairs, which Nora considered the finest music politics could make. And when someone called her difficult, as people still did, the word had lost its old bite. It did not become praise. That would have been too simple. It became a tool. A difficult woman could read a deed before signing. A difficult woman could ask why a boundary moved. A difficult woman could hold a room in silence until a man answered the question he had hoped to bury. One evening, months after the verdict, Nora sat on her porch with Abel's stopped watch open in her palm. The hands still pointed to 11 minutes past 2. She had never had it repaired. Time had ended there for Abel, and she would not pretend otherwise. But around that stopped hour, other hours had continued gathering. Inez laughing in the kitchen. Lottie's letters arriving with news from the Black Road. Children shouting near the well. Juniper butting the gate open with her usual contempt for property law. The sun slipped behind the cinders, and the black rocks turned purple at their edges. Juniper wandered out from the yard and started toward Saint's Mouth. This time, Nora did not follow. The goat knew the way, so did the truth now. It no longer had to crawl through darkness under one woman's skirt. Folded in canvas, carried like contraband through a country trained to kill it. It had roads. It had names. It had witnesses. It had a place on paper where no bought hand could erase it without leaving a mark. Nora closed the watch. The desert cooled. The first star came out over the black hills, sharp and clean. She had once believed silence was a wall. It was more like a locked room. Men like Pike built it and called it peace. Men like Ketcham guarded it and called it law. But a room can hold more than fear. It can hold a ledger under a plank, a black book behind a brick, a letter in a dead man's hand, a boy running before dawn, a woman waiting with a mule, a marshal not yet bought, a newspaper press already turning. And sometimes, if the world is stranger and kinder than it has any right to be, it can hold a one-eyed goat walking out of the Badlands with the first key caught on her horn. Nora stayed on the porch until the last light left the stones. Then she went inside, leaving the door unlatched, not because she was no longer afraid, but because fear had finally learned it did not own the house.